He didn't ask for her resume, he asked why she didn't beg. Alexander Voss stood at the head of a glass table that could seat 20, Manhattan skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like a promise no one in the room deserved. The contract lay open beneath his hand, ink still drying, the company no longer theirs. 24 hours earlier, Emily Carter had stood in the same building, on a cheaper floor with flickering lights and a coffee stain spreading across her blouse. Warm and humiliating, while her manager spoke louder than necessary, each word carefully aimed, incompetent, careless, replaceable, and the $2 million client watched with polite discomfort, saying nothing, doing nothing. Emily didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, didn't cry. She bent down instead, slow, deliberate, picking up a small, creased photo that had slipped from her pocket when the cup hit her. Her son, Liam, gap-toothed smile, missing his front tooth, holding a plastic dinosaur like it was the most important thing in the world. She wiped the edge of the photo with the corner of her sleeve, even as coffee dripped from her cuff, even as the room waited for her to break. She didn't. She stood, shoulders squared, chin level, and said only, "I understand," before walking out with a steadiness that felt louder than any protest. From the corner table, a man in a dark suit had watched without interruption, fingers resting against a glass he never lifted, eyes following not the manager, not the client, but her. Alexander Voss noticed details other people ignored, the way she didn't look around for allies, the way she didn't rush, the way dignity held even when everything else didn't. Later that night, in a car that moved through the city like it owned the streets, he asked one question: why didn't she beg? And silence answered until someone across from him said, because she didn't do anything wrong, and that was enough. By morning, numbers moved, calls were made, signatures followed, and ownership changed hands faster than rumors could catch up. Now, in the boardroom, executives shifted in their chairs, sensing the ground had already moved beneath them. Alexander closed the contract with a soft, final sound, eyes lifting at last, calm, precise. "We're making a few adjustments," he said, and the air tightened. Names were called, positions dissolved with a sentence, authority stripped without raised voices. No one argued, no one knew how. Then he turned slightly toward the glass doors, where a receptionist hesitated, unsure if she should let her in, and behind that hesitation stood Emily Carter, same posture, same quiet steadiness, wearing a clean blouse that didn't quite hide the memory of yesterday. Confusion flickered across her face as every head in the room turned. Alexander's gaze settled on her like a decision already made. He didn't smile, he didn't need to. "Ms. Carter," he said, voice even, measured, "you're not here to ask for your job back." The room held its breath, and for the first time since yesterday, Emily's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, just slightly, just enough to notice. "You're here," he continued, "to decide who deserves one." No one spoke after he said it, and that silence was heavier than anything Emily Carter had carried in her hands the day before. She stood just inside the doorway, unsure if she had stepped into the wrong room or into something far beyond her understanding, her eyes moving from one unfamiliar face to another. Men and women who yesterday had looked through her as if she were invisible now sitting rigid, waiting. She almost turned back, almost told the receptionist there had been a mistake, but then she saw him again, Alexander Voss, exactly where he had been when her world tilted, except now everything around him had shifted instead. He did not repeat himself, did not explain, he simply watched her the same way he had watched her walk away, like he was measuring something no one else could see. Emily took a slow breath, the kind she used when her son asked difficult questions she did not have answers for, and stepped forward, each footfall quiet against the polished floor, each step pulling her further from the version of herself that had walked out of this building with nothing. "I think you have the wrong person," she said finally, her voice steady even though her pulse was not. "I do not make decisions like that." A few heads in the room shifted, almost relieved to hear something normal, something that would return control to the familiar hierarchy. But Alexander did not move. "You already did," he replied, calm, precise. Yesterday, the memory landed between them. Without warning, the coffee, the voices, the way she had chosen silence instead of surrender, and for a moment Emily felt the heat on her skin again, the sting of it, the weight of every eye in that room, and the choice she had made not to give them what they wanted. "That was not a decision," she said quietly. "That was survival." Alexander's gaze did not soften, but something in it sharpened, like he had been waiting for that exact answer. "It was both," he said, and then, as if the rest of the room no longer mattered, he gestured once toward the empty chair at the table. The one at the head, the one no one had touched since he entered. The invitation was not dramatic, not forced, but it carried a weight that made the air shift again. Emily hesitated, her hand tightening slightly around the strap of her bag, her mind racing through rent-due dates, grocery lists, the sound of her son laughing at a cartoon on a small television that sometimes flickered, the reality of what she could lose if she stepped into something she did not understand, and yet there was something else, something quieter, something that had kept her from begging yesterday. She moved, slowly, deliberately, and took the seat, not because she believed she belonged there, but because walking away again would have meant accepting the version of herself they had tried to force on her. Around the table, the executives exchanged brief glances, uncertain, calculating, but none of them spoke. Alexander leaned back slightly, giving her space that felt intentional, controlled. "We will start simple," he said, his voice low but carrying. "Tell me what happened." It was not a request for a performance, not a demand for justification, it was something else, something that felt dangerously close to respect, and Emily realized in that moment that whatever this was, whatever he was offering, it was not about fixing yesterday, it was about deciding what came after. She met his eyes, not as an employee, not as someone asking for permission, but as someone who had nothing left to lose except the truth, and she began to speak. Emily did not rush her words, and that alone made the room lean closer without realizing it, because people were used to panic, to excuses, to voices that climbed when they were cornered, but hers stayed level, almost quiet, as if she was speaking to herself as much as to them. "The numbers were wrong," she said, eyes moving briefly to the far end of the table where her former manager sat, stiff and pale. "Not mine." A flicker passed across his face, quick, defensive, but he said nothing, because for the first time he did not control the outcome. Emily continued, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, grounding herself in something solid. "The report that went to the client had adjustments in it, projections that were not real. I flagged it 3 days ago." Her voice did not accuse, it simply placed facts in the air like objects no one could move once seen. "I was told to leave it alone." A murmur almost formed in the room and died just as quickly, because Alexander Voss did not look away from her, and that attention held everything still. "And yesterday," she went on, "when the client asked why the numbers did not match what they were seeing, someone needed an answer." She paused, not for effect, but because the memory still carried weight, still pressed against her chest in a way she had not fully let go of. "And I was the easiest one to give." The simplicity of it settled over the table, heavier than any argument could have been. Alexander did not interrupt, did not ask for clarification, but one of the executives shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "That is a misunderstanding," he began, voice careful, practiced, but it did not reach the end of the sentence. Alexander lifted a single hand, not high, not forceful, and the man stopped as if the rest of his words no longer existed. "Continue," Alexander said, his tone unchanged, but the permission felt different now, deliberate, chosen. Emily nodded once, more to herself than to him. "I have a son," she said, and the room stilled again, because that detail did not belong in corporate language, it did not fit into reports or meetings or liability. But she said it anyway, because it was the reason she had stayed as long as she did. "I cannot afford to lose my job," she added, and for the first time, something like vulnerability brushed the edge of her voice, not weakness, not fear, just truth. "But I cannot sign my name to something that is not honest." Her gaze lifted, steady, meeting Alexander's without hesitation now. "So I did not." The silence that followed was different from before, not tense, not uncertain, but shifting, like something had just been placed on the table that could not be ignored. Alexander's fingers tapped once against the closed contract, a soft sound, almost nothing, but it drew every eye back to him. "Names," he said, not loudly, not sharply, but with a clarity that cut through the room. Emily hesitated for half a second, not because she was unsure, but because she understood exactly what that question meant, understood that saying those names would not just explain what happened, it would change what came next. She thought of Liam again, of his small hand reaching for hers when they crossed the street, trusting her to lead, trusting her to choose the right direction even when she was not sure herself, and that thought steadied something inside her. She spoke, each name clear, measured, placed carefully into the space between them, and With each one, the weight in the room shifted further away from her and toward the people who had never expected to carry it. Alexander listened without expression, but when she finished, he leaned forward slightly, just enough to signal that something had moved from observation to decision, and in that moment, everyone in the room understood that yesterday had not been the end of her story. It had only been the moment he decided to start paying attention. The names did not echo, but their impact did, settling into the room like something permanent, something that could not be taken back or explained away. No one reached for their phone, no one shifted papers, because the usual habit suddenly felt useless. Alexander Voss remained still for a moment longer, as if allowing the weight of what had just been said to find its place. Then he opened the folder in front of him with a quiet precision that drew every eye. Inside were documents, timelines. Numbers that mirrored what Emily had described, but clearer, undeniable, stripped of the protection that titles once gave. He did not raise his voice when he spoke again, which somehow made every word land harder. These projections were altered at 3:14 p.m. on Tuesday, he said, tapping a single page. Authorization came from a terminal assigned to senior management. The man Emily had named first shifted in his seat, his expression tightening, searching for something to hold on to. There is context, he said quickly, too quickly, market pressure, expectations, we were aligning with. Alexander lifted his gaze, and the explanation stopped mid-sentence, not because it was finished, but because it no longer mattered. You were aligning with a result that did not exist, Alexander replied, calm, exact. And you chose someone to carry the consequence when it was questioned. The room absorbed that, the phrasing simple, the meaning absolute. Emily felt it too, not as vindication, not yet, but as something closer to balance, like a scale that had finally been adjusted after leaning too long in one direction. Alexander closed the folder, the soft sound marking a shift from information to outcome. This company does not operate on assumptions presented as facts, he said, his tone unchanged. And it does not remove people for refusing to participate in them. One of the executives tried again. Voice lower now, measured. We can correct the report, we can reach out to the client, there is no need to escalate. It has already been escalated, Alexander said, not interrupting, simply finishing the thought in a way that made it clear there was no return to the version of events they preferred. He turned his attention back to Emily, not as an observer this time, but as someone placing something in her hands. You said you could not sign your name to something dishonest, he said, and she nodded once, because that part was simple, because that part had cost her everything yesterday. Good, he continued, then you will not have to. There was a subtle shift in the room, a recognition that the conversation was no longer about whether she had been wronged, but about what would replace what had been broken. Alexander stood, not abruptly, but with a quiet finality that made others follow without being told. Human resources will process immediate changes, he said, and the phrasing was neutral, almost clinical, but the effect was anything but. Positions dissolved, authority redefined, not with spectacle, but with precision. He did not list consequences, he did not need to, because the absence of debate was consequence enough. Then he looked at Emily again, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that was not calculation, not distance, but recognition, as if the decision he had made yesterday had found its reason in the words she had just spoken. You will stay, he said, not as an order, not as a request, but as a statement of what was already in motion, not in the position you had, he added, and Emily felt a flicker of uncertainty rise, brief but real, but in the one that ensures this does not happen again. The meaning unfolded slowly, not fully clear, but undeniable in direction. Emily glanced down at the table for a moment, at the place where her hands rested, steady now in a way they had not been 24 hours ago, and when she looked back up, the room was no longer something happening to her, it was something she was now part of, whether she had planned for it or not. Emily did not answer right away, and that pause mattered more than any immediate acceptance could have, because for the first time since she walked into that building, she understood that saying yes would not just give her a job, it would change the shape of her life in ways she could not fully see yet. She thought of mornings rushing Liam out the door, of grocery lists calculated down to the last dollar, of nights where silence felt louder than exhaustion, and she realized this moment was not just about fairness, it was about responsibility. What exactly does that mean? She asked, her voice calm but direct, and a few people in the room shifted again, surprised she would question him at all, but Alexander did not seem surprised. If anything, he seemed to expect it. It means, he said, stepping slightly closer to the table, his presence controlled but unmistakable, that you will review what goes out before it leaves this company, and if something does not make sense, it stops. The simplicity of it was almost disarming, but the weight behind it was not. Emily held his gaze, measuring the offer the same way he had measured her, and if someone disagrees, she asked, because she knew how things worked, knew how pressure could bend decisions, how voices could get louder when power was threatened. Alexander's expression did not change, but there was a quiet certainty in the way he answered. Then they will learn to agree with what is correct. The room absorbed that. Without question, because the authority behind it was not theoretical. Emily exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in clarity, because for the first time, the rules were simple, and she could work within simple rules. I am not here to prove anyone wrong, she said, choosing her words carefully. I just need to make sure what we put out is right. Alexander gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, but it carried approval. That is why you are here, he replied. And for a moment, the conversation felt balanced, like two people defining something. Instead of one imposing it, around them, the room had quieted into something else entirely, not resistance, not even tension, but adjustment, as if everyone present was recalibrating their understanding of where they stood. Emily looked down briefly at the polished surface of the table, catching a faint reflection of herself, and she barely recognized the woman sitting there, not because she had changed overnight, but because the space around her had. She straightened slightly, her posture aligning with the role being placed in front of her, and when she spoke again, her voice carried more certainty than before. Then I will stay. The words did not echo, but they settled, firm and steady. Alexander did not smile, but there was a shift in his eyes, something quieter, more resolved, as if a decision he had already made had just been confirmed. Good, he said simply, then turned his attention back to the room, which now waited not for instruction, but for direction. We move forward, he continued, and the phrase carried a finality that left no space for what had been. One by one, people began to gather their things, not rushed, not chaotic, but aware that the structure they had relied on no longer existed in the same way. Emily remained seated for a moment longer, letting the reality settle, letting the noise of what just happened fade into something she could process. When she finally stood, the room felt different, not smaller, not larger, just clearer, like something unnecessary had been removed. As she stepped away from the table, she felt it again, that quiet shift inside her, the same one that had kept her from begging, now guiding her forward instead of away. And just before she reached the door, Alexander's voice followed, not loud, but precise enough that she did not need to turn to know he meant it. For her alone, Miss Carter, he said, and she paused. Make sure they remember why you are here. And for the first time since yesterday, Emily allowed herself a small, almost invisible nod, because she understood exactly what that meant. Emily did not go home right away, even though her body expected it, even though her routine had always been simple: leave, pick up Liam, make dinner, survive another day. Instead, she found herself standing by the window at the end of the hallway, the city stretching out beneath her in sharp lines and moving lights, everything continuing as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. Behind her, the office had already begun to shift, voices lower, movements more careful, people adjusting to a structure they no longer fully understood. She could feel it without turning around, the awareness, the quiet observation, the question hanging in the air that no one had asked yet but everyone was thinking. Who is she now? Emily pressed her fingertips lightly against the cool glass, grounding herself again, the same way she had done at the table, because the role she had just accepted did not come with instructions, only expectations. A soft sound behind her made her turn. One of the assistants standing a few steps away, hesitant but composed, holding a tablet as if it weighed more than it should. They asked me to bring you this, she said, offering it forward, and Emily took it with a small nod, the screen already filled with reports, numbers, emails waiting for approval. It started immediately, no transition, no adjustment period, just responsibility placed directly into her hands. She scrolled once, then again, her eyes catching details automatically, patterns she had trained herself to notice long before anyone paid attention to her work. Something did not align, a projection slightly inflated, a timeline too optimistic, small things that could become bigger if left untouched. She paused, feeling the familiar pressure rise, the one that had always been there, the quiet push to let it go, to not make it harder than it needed to be, but that pressure felt different now, weaker somehow. Like it no longer had the same hold. Is there something wrong? The assistant asked carefully, watching her reaction. Emily looked up, meeting her eyes, and for a moment she saw herself in that hesitation, the same uncertainty, the same calculation of what was safe to say. Not wrong, Emily replied, her voice even, just not right yet, and she handed the tablet back, sent it back for revision. The words came easier than she expected, not because the decision was simple, but because it was clear. The assistant blinked once, surprised, then nodded quickly and stepped away, already moving faster than before. Emily watched her go, then glanced down the hallway, where a few others had paused just long enough to notice what had happened before returning to their work. The message did not need to be announced, it had already started to spread. She turned back to the window for a moment, letting the quiet settle again, and that was when she noticed him, not reflected in the glass, but standing a few feet behind her, as if he had been there long enough to observe without interrupting. Alexander Voss did not speak immediately, his presence steady, deliberate, giving her space even now. You did not hesitate, he said. Finally, not as a question, not even as a comment, but as a simple acknowledgement. Emily let out a slow breath, considering the truth of that. I did, she answered honestly, just not long enough to ignore it. Alexander inclined his head slightly, as if that answer confirmed something he already knew. Good, he said, and there was that same quiet certainty again, the kind that did not need reinforcement. Emily turned fully to face him now, the distance between them measured but not uncomfortable. This is going to change things, she said, not as a warning, not as a complaint, just as a fact. Alexander met her gaze without hesitation. It already has, he replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else he could have said. Emily nodded once, because she could feel it too, not just in the room, not just in the way people moved, but in herself. In the way her decisions no longer stopped at survival but extended into something else, something larger. She adjusted the strap of her bag, a small, familiar motion that reminded her she still had somewhere else to be, someone waiting for her who did not care about boardrooms or reports, only that she came home. I have to pick up my son, she said, and for the first time, there was the faintest shift in Alexander's expression, not surprise, not disapproval, just recognition. Of course, he said, stepping aside without needing to be asked, clearing the path as if it had always been hers. Emily walked past him, steady, composed, but as she reached the end of the hallway, she realized something had changed in a way she had not expected. She was not leaving behind what had happened today, she was carrying it with her. And for once, it did not feel like a burden. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, and for the first time all day, Emily Carter was alone, no eyes on her, no expectations pressing in from every direction, just her reflection in the mirrored walls and the quiet hum of descent. She exhaled slowly, shoulders lowering just enough to feel the weight she had been carrying shift, not disappear, just rearrange into something she could hold. Her phone buzzed in her hand, the screen lighting up with a single name that mattered more than anything that had happened upstairs. Liam, and she answered before the second vibration, her voice softening in a way it had not all day. Hey, buddy, she said, and the sound of his voice on the other end, bright and unfiltered, cut through everything else. Mom, you are late, he said, not accusing, just stating a fact the way children do, and Emily smiled faintly, leaning back against the cool metal wall. I know, I am on my way, she replied, glancing at the floor numbers dropping one by one, each one pulling her further from the version of herself that had walked out of this building yesterday. When the doors opened, the city met her with its usual rhythm, traffic lights shifting, people moving with purpose, nothing pausing for her transformation, and she stepped into it without hesitation, because this was still her world too. The drive across town took longer than she wanted, red lights stretching seconds into minutes, her mind drifting back to the office despite herself. Replaying small moments, the way the assistant had looked at her, the way the room had gone quiet after her decision, the way Alexander had watched without needing to intervene. It was not power in the way she had imagined before, not loud or forceful, but precise, controlled, and that realization settled somewhere deeper than she expected. By the time she pulled into the daycare parking lot, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the asphalt, parents gathering their children, conversations overlapping in a familiar pattern that grounded her instantly. Liam spotted her before she even reached the door, his small figure breaking away from the group, sneakers hitting the pavement with quick, uneven steps, and when he reached her, he wrapped his arms around her waist with a certainty that no boardroom could match. "You said you would be here earlier," he said into her jacket, his voice muffled but steady, and Emily crouched slightly, brushing a hand through his hair. "I know," she repeated, meeting his eyes now. Today was different. He studied her for a moment, as if trying to measure what that meant, then nodded once, accepting it without needing an explanation. As they walked back to the car, his hand slipped into hers, small and warm, and she felt it again. That quiet shift inside her, the one that had started in the boardroom but followed her here, blending into something more personal, more real. "Did you fix it?" Liam asked suddenly, climbing into his seat, buckling himself in with practiced effort, and Emily paused, the question simple but carrying more meaning than he knew. She closed the door gently, leaning against it for a second before answering. "I think I started to," she said, and as she moved around to the driver's side, she caught her reflection in the car window, not changed in any obvious way, still the same tired eyes, the same familiar lines, but something underneath it had shifted, something steadier, something that did not bend as easily. She started the engine, the soft vibration filling the space, and as they pulled out of the lot, her phone buzzed again, a message this time, brief, direct, from a number she now recognized without needing a name. "Tomorrow, 8 a.m., it read, nothing more, no signature, no explanation, and Emily glanced at it once before setting the phone down, her focus returning to the road ahead, because for the first time, tomorrow did not feel like something she had to survive, it felt like something she was walking into on her own terms. The morning came earlier than she expected, not because the clock moved faster, but because her mind never fully settled the night before, thoughts layering quietly beneath the surface until the alarm cut through at 6 a.m. Emily Carter sat up slowly, the room still dim, the faint hum of the city already awake beyond her window, and for a moment she stayed there, letting the reality of yesterday catch up to the stillness of now. Liam's door was slightly open, a soft light spilling into the hallway, and she could hear the faint sound of his cartoon already playing, his small routine unchanged. Steady in a way that grounded her, she moved through the motions carefully, making breakfast, packing his bag, tying his shoes, each step familiar, each one reminding her that no matter what had shifted, this part of her life remained the same. "You look different," Liam said suddenly, glancing up at her over his cereal, his voice thoughtful, not teasing, and Emily paused, considering that. "Do I?" she asked, and he nodded once, serious, "like when I get a gold star at school," he added, and something in her chest softened, a small, unexpected warmth. "Then I guess that is a good thing," she replied, brushing a crumb from his cheek. The drive back into the city felt shorter, not because traffic had changed, but because her focus had, her thoughts no longer circling the same worries, but moving forward instead, aligning with something she had not allowed herself to consider before. When she dropped Liam off and continued on, the building came into view sooner than she expected, the glass reflecting the morning light in sharp lines, and for a brief second, she felt the weight of stepping back into that space, not as she had been, but as something new, something not yet fully defined. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted again, quieter, more deliberate, conversations lower, movements measured, and as she walked through the lobby, she noticed the way people looked at her now, not openly, not boldly, but with a kind of awareness that had not been there before. It was not admiration, not fear, but recognition, and she did not slow her pace, did not acknowledge it beyond a steady posture that carried her forward. The elevator ride was shorter this time, the mirrored walls reflecting a version of her that felt more aligned with what she carried inside, and when the doors opened, she stepped out without hesitation. Her desk was no longer where it had been, not tucked into the corner, not positioned to be overlooked, but moved, central, visible, and waiting, a quiet statement made without words. A tablet rested on the surface, already active, already filled with work that did not pause for adjustment, and as she approached, she noticed something else, a small framed photo placed carefully beside it, not something she had left there, but one that matched exactly the image she carried in her bag. Liam's gap-toothed smile, the same plastic dinosaur held proudly in his hand. Emily stopped for a fraction of a second, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame, the detail too precise to be coincidence, too intentional to ignore. "We thought you should have something that matters within reach," a voice said from behind her, and she turned to see the same assistant from yesterday, standing a few steps back, her expression more certain now, less hesitant. Emily nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement, and placed her bag down beside the desk, the motion grounding her again. As she picked up the tablet, the first report opened automatically, numbers aligning in clean rows, expectations clear, and she moved through it without pause, her focus settling into the rhythm she knew. Across the room, she could feel it again, that presence, not intrusive, not demanding, but steady, watching, and when she glanced up, Alexander Voss stood near the far end, speaking quietly to someone before his gaze shifted, meeting hers for just a moment. There was no nod, no gesture, just a brief acknowledgement that carried more weight than anything spoken, and then he turned away, continuing as if everything was already in motion. Emily returned her attention to the screen, her fingers steady, her mind clear, because for the first time, she was not reacting to what happened around her, she was shaping it, one decision at a time, and as the morning unfolded, she realized something else had changed. The uncertainty that once followed her had been replaced by something quieter, something stronger, the understanding that she was no longer just trying to hold her place, she was defining it. The first challenge did not arrive loudly, it came quietly, disguised as routine, buried in a report that most people would have approved without a second glance. Emily Carter noticed it halfway through her second review of the morning, a set of numbers that aligned too perfectly. Projections that curved upward just enough to impress but not enough to alarm, the kind of subtle adjustment that could pass as optimism if no one looked closely. She paused, her finger hovering over the screen, her mind retracing the logic step by step, and there it was, a small inconsistency in the base data, something shifted just slightly out of place. She leaned back in her chair, not reacting immediately, not calling attention to it, because she understood now that how she responded mattered just as much as what she found. Across the room, the rhythm of work continued, keyboards clicking, voices low, but she could feel it again, that underlying awareness, people watching without appearing to, waiting to see how far this new structure would actually go. Emily tapped the screen once, pulling up the original source file, then the revision history, her eyes moving quickly, efficiently, tracing the changes back to a single entry point, a name she recognized from the previous day, not one of the executives removed, but someone who had remained, someone who had learned quickly enough to stay. She stood, the movement small but noticeable, and walked across the floor with steady steps, stopping beside a desk where a man sat rigidly upright the moment she approached. He looked up, his expression carefully neutral, but there was tension in his posture, the kind that came from knowing something might be questioned. "Can you walk me through this?" Emily said, her tone even. Not accusing, just direct. He glanced at the screen, then back at her. "It is within acceptable range," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "The client expects growth, this reflects. The client expects accuracy." Emily interrupted gently, not raising her voice, not cutting him off sharply, just redirecting the focus to something that could not be argued. She angled the tablet slightly so he could see the discrepancy, the small shift that changed the entire projection, and for a moment he said nothing, his eyes scanning the numbers again, searching for a defense that would hold. "It is a minor adjustment," he said finally, but the confidence in his voice had thinned. Emily held his gaze, steady, unyielding but not confrontational. "Then it will be a minor correction," she replied, and that was all. No lecture, no escalation, just a decision stated as fact. Around them, a few heads lifted briefly before returning to their work, the message moving through the room without needing to be announced. The man nodded once, already turning back to his screen, already making the change, because resistance no longer held the same weight it once did. Emily stepped back, not lingering, not pressing further, because the point had already been made. As she returned to her desk, she felt it again, that shift, not in the room this time, but in herself, the growing certainty that she did not need to force authority for it to exist. It was already there, in the consistency of her choices, in the clarity of her standards. She sat down, picking up the next report without hesitation, her focus settling into the rhythm that was becoming her own, and as the hours moved forward, the work around her adjusted, small corrections appearing before she had to point them out, decisions aligning more closely with what was expected. late in the afternoon, as the light outside softened and the pace of the office slowed slightly, a message appeared on her screen, brief, direct, from the same number as before, "Meet me upstairs." It read, no time, no explanation, and Emily looked at it for a moment, considering, before setting the tablet down and standing. The path to the upper floor was quieter, more private, the noise of the main office fading with each step, and when she reached the door, she paused for just a second before knocking lightly. The response came immediately, "Come in," and as she stepped inside, she realized this conversation would not be about numbers, or reports, or corrections, it would be about something else entirely. The office on the upper floor felt different the moment Emily Carter stepped inside, quieter, not because there was less activity, but because everything here moved with intention, every detail placed, every sound controlled. Alexander Voss stood by the window, the city stretching behind him in sharp lines of glass and steel, his posture relaxed but deliberate, as if he owned not just the room but everything beyond it. He did not turn immediately when she entered, giving her a moment to take in the space, to adjust, to decide how she would stand in it. Emily closed the doors softly behind her, the sound barely noticeable, and waited, not uncertain, not hesitant, just aware that this conversation would not follow the same pattern as the ones before. "You are adapting faster than most," Alexander said finally, his voice calm, measured, as he turned to face her, his eyes settling on her with the same quiet focus that had followed her from the beginning. Emily met his gaze, steady. "I am doing what needs to be done," she replied, and there was no attempt to impress in her tone, no need to justify, just a simple truth. Alexander took a few steps closer, stopping at a distance that felt deliberate. Not intrusive, but close enough to make it clear that this was no longer about observation alone. "Most people," he said, "when given authority, they test it, they push, they see how far it reaches." He paused briefly, as if weighing his next words. "You do not." Emily considered that for a moment, her fingers resting lightly against the back of a chair, grounding herself again in something physical. "Because it is not about how far it reaches," she said quietly, "it is about where it should stop." The answer hung in the air between them, simple, but carrying a weight that shifted something in the room. Alexander's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in his gaze, something more focused, more certain, as if a line had just been drawn and he approved of where she placed it. "That is why you are here," he said, echoing his words from before, but this time with a different emphasis, not as an explanation, but as confirmation. Emily glanced briefly toward the window. The city moving beyond it, then back to him. "You could have fixed this without me," she said, not questioning, just stating what she knew, because someone like him did not need her to correct reports or restructure a team. Alexander did not deny it, did not soften it. "Yes," he said simply, and the honesty of it made the room feel clearer, not harsher. Emily nodded once, accepting that. "Then why me?" she asked. And this time there was something different in her voice, not doubt, not insecurity, but a need to understand the reason behind everything that had shifted so quickly. Alexander held her gaze for a moment longer than before, as if considering how much to say, or perhaps deciding whether the question deserved an answer at all. "Because you did not ask to stay," he said finally, his tone even, "and you did not ask to be right, you simply were." The words settled slowly, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but precise in a way that made them difficult to ignore. Emily felt that settle somewhere deeper than she expected, not as praise, not as validation, but as recognition, something she had not realized she needed until it was given without condition. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, not empty, but full of something unspoken. Something that did not need to be defined yet. Alexander stepped back slightly, the movement small but intentional, returning the space to something more neutral, more controlled. "There will be resistance," he said, shifting the conversation forward, "not open, not obvious, but it will be there." Emily nodded, because she had already seen it, felt it in the hesitation of others, in the careful way they watched her decisions. "Then it will be corrected," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her voice now, no uncertainty, just a steady certainty that matched the role she had stepped into. Alexander gave a slight nod, not approving, not commanding, just acknowledging that she understood. As Emily turned toward the door, ready to return to the work waiting below, his voice followed once more, quieter this time, almost reflective. "Do not let them make you smaller," he said, and she paused, her hand resting lightly on the door handle, the words settling in a way that felt different. From everything else he had said, she did not turn back, did not respond immediately, but after a brief second, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, because she understood that this was not just advice, it was a line she would have to hold, again and again, and as she stepped out of the room, closing the doors softly behind her, she realized that what he had given her was not just a position. It was something more difficult to carry, the expectation that she would not become less just to make others comfortable. The resistance did not arrive as confrontation, it came as omission, as silence in meetings where voices once filled the space, as emails that circled decisions without committing to them, as small delays that stretched timelines just enough to test how far Emily Carter would allow things to slip. She noticed it by midday, not in one clear moment, but in a pattern that formed quietly beneath the surface, subtle enough to deny, obvious enough to matter. She sat at her desk, reviewing a proposal that had been revised twice already, each version cleaner, safer, but still avoiding the core issue she had flagged earlier, and she understood then that this was not about correction anymore, it was about compliance. About whether people would follow her direction when it required more than small adjustments. Emily set the tablet down for a second, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk, grounding herself the way she had learned to do, and then she stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with a steady intention that drew a few quiet glances as she moved across the room. "Can we take a moment?" she said, her voice calm but clear, and the nearest conversation paused, then another, until the room settled into a quiet that felt different from the one imposed by authority, this one chosen, this one attentive. She did not raise her voice, did not rush her words. "The revisions are cleaner," she continued, holding the tablet at her side, not using it as a shield, "but the issue is still there. A few people shifted slightly, not defensive, but aware, and that awareness was enough." She looked at the group, not focusing on one person, but including everyone in the responsibility. "We are not adjusting the presentation," she said, "we are fixing the problem." The distinction was simple, but it landed, because it removed the option to work around what mattered. There was a brief pause, the kind that could either break into resistance or settle into understanding, and then one voice spoke, careful, measured, "It will take more time," and Emily nodded once, acknowledging that without hesitation. "Then it takes more time," she replied, and there was no frustration in her tone, no pressure beyond the clarity of the expectation. The room absorbed that, the tension easing not because the work became easier, but because the direction became unmistakable. Someone else spoke next, offering a solution, then another, and slowly, the conversation shifted, not avoiding the problem, but moving directly through it. Emily listened, not controlling every word, not needing to, just guiding where necessary, adjusting when something moved off course, and for the first time since she stepped into this role, the resistance did not disappear, it changed, turning into something more useful, something that worked with her instead of against her. Across the room, she noticed a few people watching more closely now, not questioning her authority, but understanding it, and that difference mattered. When the discussion settled into action, when tasks were assigned and timelines adjusted to reflect what was actually required, Emily stepped back, allowing the momentum to carry forward without her constant presence. She returned to her desk, the quiet around her different now, less uncertain, more aligned, and as she picked up the next report, she realized that what had shifted was not just the structure of the work, but the way people responded to it. A message appeared on her screen, brief, familiar, good, it read, nothing more, and she did not need to look up to know who it was from. Emily allowed herself a small breath, not relief, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement, because this was not about being right, it was about being consistent. As the afternoon light softened and the office settled into a steady rhythm, she glanced once toward the far end of the room, where the glass walls reflected movement she could not fully see, and she understood that this was only the beginning, not of a position, but of a standard that would be tested again and again, and this time, she was ready to hold it. The shift did not stop at the floor she could see, it traveled upward, outward, settling into corners she had not yet stepped into, and Emily Carter realized it late in the afternoon when a calendar notification appeared on her screen, not a request, not a suggestion, but a scheduled meeting she had not created. She opened it, her eyes scanning the details quickly, a client review, high priority, set for the next morning, attendees listed with titles she had only seen in passing before, and her Name placed at the center, not as support, not as observer, but as lead. She leaned back slightly in her chair, letting the implication settle, because this was different from internal corrections, this was external, visible, something that would define more than just process. A soft knock on the edge of her desk drew her attention, the same assistant standing there again, but this time without hesitation, without uncertainty. They confirmed the meeting, she said, offering a folder forward. They expect a revised projection by tonight. Emily took the folder, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper, feeling the weight of expectation in a way that was familiar, but no longer overwhelming. She opened it, scanning the contents, the same project she had flagged earlier, now escalated, now visible beyond the company walls, and she understood immediately what this was. Not a test of ability, but of consistency, whether she would hold the same standard when the pressure shifted outward. She closed the folder gently, not rushing, not reacting, just aligning her thoughts with what needed to be done. Then we give them the right one, she said, her voice even, and the assistant nodded once, already turning to relay the direction. As the office moved into the later hours, the rhythm changed again, fewer conversations, more focus, the kind that comes when time becomes a factor but clarity remains. Emily worked through the report piece by piece, not alone, but not relying on others to carry it either, guiding where necessary, correcting where needed, ensuring that every number matched not expectation, but reality. There were moments when the easier path presented itself, small adjustments that would smooth the presentation, make the outcome look cleaner, but she recognized them for what they were, the same pattern that had led to everything before, and she did not follow them. The light outside dimmed slowly, the city shifting into evening. Reflections replacing views, and still she worked, steady, precise, until the final version sat complete in front of her. She reviewed it one more time, not because she doubted it, but because she respected the responsibility it carried, then sent it forward without hesitation. A moment later, a reply appeared, not from the client, not from the team, but from the same number that had followed her through the day, on time. It read, nothing more, and Emily allowed herself a brief pause, not satisfaction, not relief, just acknowledgement that she had held the line. She gathered her things slowly, the office around her nearly empty now, the quiet different from before, not uncertain, not tense, but settled, and as she stepped away from her desk, her eyes caught the small photo beside it again, Liam's smile unchanged, steady in a way that reminded her why none of this could shift her core. As she moved toward the elevator, the path clear, the building quieter than it had been all day, she realized that tomorrow would not just be another step, it would be the moment everything she had set into motion would be seen, judged, and tested beyond her control, and this time, she was not walking into it hoping to be accepted, she was walking into it ready to stand by what she had built. The room was already filled when Emily Carter walked in, not crowded, but complete, every seat taken, every screen lit, the kind of meeting where every detail mattered before a single word was spoken. The client's voice came through clearly from the large display, confident, measured, used to being answered with certainty, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it would have the week before, structured, predictable, controlled. Emily took her place at the head of the table without hesitation, not because she felt entitled to it, but because she understood what had been placed there, and what it required. She did not rush into the presentation, did not fill the silence with rehearsed lines, she simply opened the report, her fingers steady as she aligned the screen with the data she had built piece by piece the night before. We made adjustments, she began, her voice calm, clear, carrying without force. And every eye in the room shifted toward her, not questioning, not doubting, but waiting. She walked them through it step by step, not highlighting what looked good, but what was real, where projections held, where they needed correction, where expectations had to be grounded in something measurable, something honest. There were moments where the client paused, where the silence stretched just long enough to test the confidence behind her words, but Emily did not fill those gaps, she let them exist. Because she was no longer trying to convince, she was presenting something that did not require approval to be valid. This lowers the projected margin, the client said finally, their tone neutral but edged with concern, and the room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for the familiar shift, the adjustment that would soften the truth. Emily met the camera directly, her posture unchanged. It aligns the margin with what we can actually deliver, she replied. And there was no hesitation, no apology, just clarity. The silence that followed was Different this time, not tension, not resistance, but consideration, real, measured. And then the client nodded once, slowly. We prefer accuracy over correction later, they said, and the weight that lifted in the room was quiet, almost invisible, but undeniable. The meeting moved forward after that, questions more direct, answers more grounded, the conversation shifting into something more stable. Something that did not need to be maintained by appearances. When it ended, the screens dimmed, the room exhaled, and for a moment, no one spoke, because the outcome had not just resolved a single project, it had reset the expectation of how things would be done. Emily closed the report, her movements unhurried, her focus still steady, and as she stood, she felt it again, that shift, not external this time, not in the room, but within herself, the quiet understanding that she had not just held the line, she had defined it, across the room. Through the glass, Alexander Voss stood exactly where he had been before. Not intervening, not directing, simply observing, and when their eyes met, there was no need for acknowledgement, no need for approval, because everything that needed to be understood had already been demonstrated. Emily gathered her things, the small photo of Liam catching the light for a brief second as she placed it back into her bag, and as she walked toward the door, the space around her felt different again. Not because she had changed it once, but because she had proven it could hold, and just before she stepped out, a quiet realization settled in, steady and certain, that what had started as survival had become something else entirely, something stronger, something that no longer depended on who stood across from her, because the standard she carried was now her own, and she was not giving it back.